at it at the end of the day from a liability perspective and do not want to scare you all away. But I specialise in product liability and product safety. I was just going to spend a few minutes today just talking about some practical steps to take in response to a safety incident and what sort of best practice might look like in handling them. I'm speaking generally about drugs or medical device companies, and I'm not focusing on the specific products per se, but these principles apply broadly and equally to sort of customer, consumer, everyday products, right up to the equipment in the hospitals, the X-ray and MRI equipment. But I mean, unfortunately, as it is, some of the most damaging risks that a company faces can be those relating to product and operational safety. And a device recall or some form of corrective action can have a significant impact on a pharma company and on the future of the concerned product. So really, the key is careful planning, and that is needed to help mitigate all of these risks. And the importance of planning and being well prepared in advance of any product safety incident can't be overemphasized. The risks here that we're talking about in failing to sort of adequately address a safety incident can be losing consumer and patient confidence, significant damage to the brand, crashing stock prices and profits, liability in contract and tort claims, and actually even criminal liability and regulatory sanctions. So all of these risks really do need to be assessed from the outset, and ideally companies will have in place a product safety incident response or recall plan that has been stress tested and even tried out as mock sort of recalls, so that everybody that's involved knows how to be mobilized quickly and action the plan in the right way. And actually the in-house legal team, I think, play a real pivotal role in responding to a safety incident. And so it is important that companies mobilize the in-house lawyers from the outset, and that they work alongside the regulatory team, the testing and the quality assurance teams and the technical teams to ensure that there is a swift response and a very efficient way in deciding what action needs to be taken, and if a recall is required, which of course is a last resort, but unfortunately at times is what's needed. So just onto the next slide. What can a company do then to get itself in the best position and planned to be best prepared for an incident? I think if they do some of the things I'll just talk about briefly now, they will be better placed. And the first is, of course, understanding the risks associated with the company's products. A company that really understands the risks of the products will, I think, find that any resultant safety issues are easier to manage. And so you must have your systems in place where you can quickly access and provide the details about the products. Of course, this is required as part of the company's regulatory obligations. But effective complaints and vigilance systems really do assist in mitigating product liability risks. So you need to know, of course, the product details, the description, the model, the serial number, the lot details, and of course have complete visibility and traceability over your supply chain and the manufacturer, distributors, and all the entities involved and their contact details, and really be able to trace those products throughout the world, and broken down by jurisdiction where they are in the supply chain, and have an understanding of what contractual protections you have in place in relation to the product. And then it goes without saying that, of course, the company must comply with all its regulatory requirements, and Taz and Alison touched on some of those earlier, and the quality and safety controls. And I often advise clients that they should think about regularly training the business teams and the staff, and particularly those who are likely to be involved in implementing a recall, and actually even establishing what we would call crisis management teams, and ensure that, as I said at the beginning, that is stress tested and even applied in some form of a mock recall. And then another important point is that companies must ensure that the appropriate product information is supplied with the product. And again, this is, of course, all required for regulatory purposes, but it's really important not to forget how important it is from a product liability perspective, because not only do you have those obligations under the regulations, but there is a very broad definition of a defective product under the Consumer Protection Act, which derives from the European Product Liability Directive. Essentially, it's assessed in accordance with the safety that a person generally is entitled to expect, just a general standard of safety, which is a very broad definition. But what gets taken into account when assessing that are things like the manner in which the product is marketed, its get instructions for use, its warnings, and what it might reasonably be expected to be done on or with or in relation to the product. So really, the in-house lawyer must be close to the regulatory team and the compliance team with regard to any changes to labels, any changes to instructions for use, and any warnings, because unfortunately product liability claims that involve pharma companies and medical device companies are often founded on some form of failure to warn or an inadequacy in the instructions for use, pursuant to which the claimant's lawyers will assert an argument that the company always knew that there was an issue with this and didn't act on it, or in some way buried some of the data and therefore could have avoided an incident at a later stage. Then, of course, there are contractual protections. I won't talk in any detail about those for now because we're up against it with the time, but there's obviously ways in which you can transfer the risk of product safety issues and mitigate those product liability claims. And that's in the usual way of, appropriate limitations, exclusions of liability and warranties, indemnities. And then insurance, which, again, Alison and Taz touched on, but just a word of a note on insurance from my perspective is that it doesn't often cover product recall costs. And the actual costs of a recall can be really, really quite significant, particularly where you're talking about one with international scope, where you've got to liaise with local lawyers, you've got to consult and engage multiple health authorities in different jurisdictions. You've got to put your FSNs and your field safety corrective reports, action reports, across a wide geographical reach. So really, it's important, I think, to be aware that there is an opportunity to get recall costs under the insurance. And of course, your contracts will hopefully set out the obligations on all the parties in the supply chain as to what they need to do to comply with whatever corrective action is chosen and taken by the manufacturer. And so I said at the beginning that really there should be a product recall incident plan in place, because in the event of a recall, you want to be able to mobilise the team quickly and get everybody on board. And this really should include legal, regulatory, compliance, and PR. And I think that can't be underestimated. The reputational impact of a safety incident is really real. And I think, in order to be prepared, your response plan, your recall plan needs to have some form of reactive statements or proactive statements, some form of communications that you are going to address and put out there, in addition to obviously your obligations to put a field safety notice and make your relevant notifications. But I think the PR aspect can't be underestimated. But what would a contingency plan look like? What would it involve? Well, it would need to address the way in which the risk assessment is going to be put together. So this is the way in which the manufacturer will assess the risk pursuant to either a health hazard evaluation or what we call in the UK a risk assessment. So it will look at the nature of the safety risk that's arisen, whether or not that's in response to an actual adverse incident. It can often be just by way of a complaint rather than an actual specific incident. What is it? What's the probability and likelihood of harm? What's the severity of the harm? Are there any vulnerable users? Children and the elderly being the obvious ones. And has this identified any sort of resultant abnormal risk with the product? Because of course, with medical devices and drugs, there is always this inherent risk, and everybody knows you have to do the risk benefit analysis with them. But it's important to really properly assess what a safety issue is that has been identified, and the extent to which that may bring out new issues in relation to the product that may well have been previously unknown. And then, of course, it's identifying the root cause, and then putting in place the plans for making your notifications to the authorities and the practical methods and the ways in which you will actually implement the recall. So just a note on the field safety notices, that is a communication that has to be sent by the manufacturer or the distributor. And usually from our experience, there'll be some cooperation between the very relevant parties in the supply chain. There is a template, and the European Commission has produced that. There is MHRA guidance, and there are specific mandatory requirements and details that have to be included in your field safety notice. And one I think that people tend to forget is that you have to just put out there in bold that it is an urgent field safety notice, and there's no sort of getting around it. There's no precautionary language or we think there's something potentially an issue here. If there's an issue, there's an issue, and you just have to put it out there. And the aim of the field safety corrective action is to reach out to as many end users as possible to mitigate patient safety, which of course is first and foremost the priority. And then once you are in the process and you are implementing your recall, you also need to monitor the progress, and you will be expected by the regulators to provide your updates and your final field safety correction action report. And there's no set point when that's deemed to have been successfully completed. The authorities may give you some guidance, they may set out some timelines, there may be some sort of measurable objectives, but really it's for the manufacturer to determine, and the distributor and the entities in the supply chain, as to how best they can determine whether this is, they've reached a point that it's been successful. So just in the last minute, I'll just say another word on reputation management, because I think really, aside from implementing the recall, one really needs to be mindful that pharmaceutical companies, are often accused of failing to respond quickly enough, failing to respond broadly, and reaching out to as many consumers and end users as possible. So I think speed is really of the essence in a safety incident, and managing the PR comms, because, as I said, I think that sometimes gets forgotten as well, because you're so focused on dealing with the regulatory aspect and dealing with your notifications that perhaps you might not have mobilized the PR teams. And we would always say involve lawyers in that as well, because sorry does always seem to be the hardest word, and should very much always be used with caution. So I think on that canter through, because I'm going to keep to time, we will, I'll pass to Alison, or we will pass, I think, to head over to speak to the fireside chat, I think, with Sir Robin J.